up with this noise? That's not good. So I basically think there's two types of people out there in the world. Both of them gets really annoyed when their bike starts creaking or making weird noises, but only one of them secretly gets a bit excited by the fact that it's time to go creak hunting. And if you are one of those people, welcome. So, spoiler alert, the creak came from this Extralite Cyberhub SPD3. So this video will be kind of a deep dive into this particular hub, but stuff like bearing replacement procedures will be pretty similar to any kind of PAL-based hub out there. So I still think you can use this as a general guide, even if you don't have this specific model of hub. And of course, if you have a DT Swiss EXP hub, I have done an extensive video on that as well, so check that out. But before I started to pull everything apart like a crazy maniac, I always try to go down the path of least resistance. So on this ride where this noise appeared, it was pretty apparent that it came from the rear hub, because the creaking noise was very disconnected from the way I pedaled, for example. So I could exclude bottom bracket problems or pedal problems pretty easily. So the first thing I did out on the ride, I removed the through axle just to check that there wasn't any gunk there causing a havoc. I also checked that the lock ring was properly torqued down, or there wasn't any play on any of the cogs that can also create a similar kind of noise. Not that I'd ride around with a lock ring in my pocket on my rides, but at least that would have informed me if I needed to get to the nearest bail station, or if I can continue on annoying my friends for the rest of the day. And that's what I did. Annoy my friend, that is. But once I got home, the surgery began. Now, let's be real, I do think we should try and keep the power tools away from our bikes, especially when it comes to the weight-winning stuff. Sometimes though, it's just too tempting to take a few shortcuts. Do as I say, not as I do, and all that crap. Anyway, with the rotor and the cassette removed, I can get to the meat of this Extralite SPD3 rear hub. Starting by removing the end cap with the help of two 17mm ring spanners. Once loosened, the dry side end cap easily comes off by hand. The non-dry side end cap will stay attached to the hub axle. After that, the free hub body can easily slide off to reveal the pawl system. And I'm always surprised how simple this is. The pawls are simply spring-loaded with an O-ring, and I guess the two-pawl design is a reason why the shortest gear ratio is 1:1 for this hub. All for the grams though, it's all for the grams. Of course, I will take the opportunity to do a bit of deep cleaning, so I remove the O-ring and the pawls, as well as the bigger O-ring that keeps most of the outside nature from creeping into the free hub mechanism. Then I simply wipe off the worst of the gunk with some Scott paper towels. Very versatile piece of bike cleaning equipment, if I do say so myself. Once the obvious nastiness is removed, a bit of alcohol on that towel helps with the more stubborn parts. And to get down and clean the small holes for the pawls, some cotton swabs do come in handy. Now with that complete, I could confirm my suspicion that there was an issue with one or more of the bearings. The inner bearing is definitely worn. I tried to demo this by putting it close to the mic. It wasn't that clear in audio as what I felt with my fingers, but comparing it with the outer bearing here, you might hear the difference. The outer bearing was actually swapped already back in 2002 to an NTN bearing. This inner one is still the original Enduro base level bearing that came with the hub. With that confirmed, I cleaned the pawls and the O-rings as well with some isopropyl alcohol and gave it all a good inspection. By the way, isopropyl alcohol should not be harmful to the rubber O-rings, but stronger cleaner solution might be, so just be a bit careful there. All these parts you can also get as spares. So if I feel something needs replacing, I have a set on hand. These seemed fine though, so I will reuse them at least until the next doctor's appointment. With the Freehub body removed from the hub, I can push the hub axle out through the non-dry side like so. Gave it a good clean and an inspection. I can definitely see some marks on the aluminium axle left by the steel bearings. Nothing I'm worried about at this stage, and I don't think this was the cause of the noise either. If the axle would have looked really toast, this is also available as spares from Extralite. As I started to clean up the ratchet side, I quickly felt that this bearing too had seen better days, especially when I put a bit of force through the bearing. This was also the original standard Enduro bearings, so I was not surprised this was the case when the bearing sitting next to it in the Freehub body had the same feeling. The non-drive side of the hub was swapped for an NTM bearing last year together with the outer Freehub one, and that was still running silky smooth. So my conclusion here was that these two older Enduro bearings was the cause for the noise and needed to be changed. I will have all the bearing specifications for this Extralite hub set in the descriptions as well, but the dry side hub bearing is the larger 6903 size, while the remaining three bearings are the slightly smaller 6803. Bearing removal for me is always kind of a nerve-wracking experience, especially with these lightweight hubs. So rather than resting the hub shell against a hard surface and hammer away, I put one side of the wheel against the table and the other side against my rock-hard abs, as I use my punch to gently tap out the bearing in a zigzag pattern. Maybe I'm just overly paranoid, but it works. Since the NTM bearings from last year are still rolling silky smooth, the new ones will also be NTM bearings with the LLB seals, which are the low friction ones. Before pressing those in though, I need to clean the bearing seat with some alcohol and wipe it dry. Apply a thin layer of fresh grease before the bearing gets pressed in. Now, you can definitely build your own little homemade bearing press by using the old bearing as a drift. Get a threaded rod and some washers from your local hardware store, and you're more or less good to go. I happen to have this rather nice bearing press kit. A couple of years ago, this type of kit would probably run you several $100. These days though, you can find this pretty damn cheap at your outlet of choice. I think I paid about $35 converted on Amazon Japan for this kit. Apart from looking really cool, this will make bearing installations very easy, since it includes drifts for all the standard bearing sizes, and there's also 2 drifts per size. Having a drift on the opposite side of the bearing being pressed in will keep the rod in the center and help assure that the bearing won't get pressed in a weird angle. Now, for a one-off bearing job, it's probably overkill, I will admit. But if you're a tinkerer like me that might do a few bearing jobs per year, it's definitely worth the price of a few fancy caffeinated milk drinks and a pizza, in my opinion. Just a reminder, we're not installing a bottom bracket, so no need to go crazy like 15 Newton meters with the press. Once the bearing bottoms out, that's quite enough. Done. Smooth as silk. Yeah, I love these NTM bearings. Removing the bearing from the Freehub is basically the same. I just hold the Freehub body in my hand and hammer out the bearing with a punch like this. The replacement will be the same model NTN 6803 that's on the outside. But first a little cleaning up on the bearing seat with alcohol. Make sure that's nice and dry. Apply a thin layer of grease again before pressing in the bearing. Since both sides has the same bearing dimensions, it's really handy that the bearing press kit comes with 2 drifts in all sizes. Just keeping everything nice and square as I press that in. I did notice that I probably should have swapped the press handles around, since the one on the right here has the slipping washer and should be used on the side that presses in the new bearing. Not the end of the world though, as you can see, it still lets the washer rotate as the Freehub itself rotates as I press, but I'm sure some of you out there noticed my mistake as well. So that's it, new bearings in and all spinning like a dream. So all that's left is the reassembly. As for the Freehub, it's pretty straightforward. Extralite specify you should oil the O-rings with a thin oil, and oil thicker than W40 could increase drag. I don't have any kind of oil on hand, so I went a bit off script and used the Extralite Alugrease Super 1 for this task. This might not be optimal, but it's worked for me in the past, so I'm living on the edge, I guess. And speaking of that, Alugrease Super 1, that's the grease that gets included when you buy an Extralite wheel set or hubs, and they insist that this is what you should use in the Freehub body mechanism. I'm sure you could use other stuff as well, but Extralite specifically cautions against using lithium grease or very thick grease. In any case, I see no reason to use anything else. That's what comes supplied with the hubs, so that's what I'm using. After the pulse and O-ring spring is in place, I just make sure they have that spring back when pushed in. Then I apply another layer of that Extralite grease on the ratchet in the hub shell. Using a small brush makes it a little less messy. Before I push the hub axle back in, I will loosen the micro adjuster that sits on the axle. Normally it should be fine leaving it as is, but just in case I managed to have tightened this by mistake during this assembly, loosening it half a turn doesn't really hurt. A little bit of grease on the axle itself and it should slide in without excessive force. With that in place, I can reinstall the Freehub body. Pushing the pulse with a pick at the same time as turning the Freehub body helps it slide into place. After confirming that the Freehub is actually working, as a Freehub should, all that's left is to put a bit of grease on the end cap threads, thread the end cap back onto the axle, and tighten it down to 7 to 8 Nm. Now, as I briefly mentioned, I did loosen the micro adjuster, so I do have a little play in the Freehub. To fix this, I tighten the micro adjuster by a quarter turn at a time until the play is gone. I also double check this once the wheel is on the bike. If you have this kind of play in the hub, you can end up with a similar creaking sound and eventually causing even more damage, so it never hurts to double check. Now, I'm sure you already know how to put a cassette and a disc rotor back on, so no need to bore you with that. Just remember, always keep your power tools away from the bike. Now, if someone is wondering if it's worth popping the seals, do a deep clean and repack the bearings, on these really tiny hub bearings, I haven't really had any long-term success with that method. And high-quality steel bearings from the likes of NTM, for example, they are cheap enough that, in my opinion, it's not worth the hassle. It's better to start over on a new, clean slate, so to speak. If you had spent a lot of money on overpriced ceramic bearings, well, that's your own damn fault. When it comes to bottom brackets and headset bearings though, I had better luck with that whole clean process, so I wouldn't immediately jump to a replacement in that case for whatever that's worth. So hopefully there's some Extralite legends out there that found this helpful. If not, and you're still watching, I'm sorry, but Merry Christmas and may your bearings keep on spinning forever. Peace. You might not be able to hear for the wind, but you stayed silent. Score for the Creak hunters again.